When I walked into that law office in downtown Phoenix and saw my brother Marcus sitting across from Mom's attorney with a stack of legal documents, I knew my life was about to change forever. The house I had grown up in, the house I had spent $14,000 to help Mom keep when she needed emergency surgery, was no longer hers. It was his, and nobody had bothered to tell me. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss.
The attorney, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses named Mr. Henderson, looked genuinely uncomfortable as he explained that my mother, Linda Rodriguez, had legally transferred the deed to her 3-bedroom ranch house to my younger brother Marcus, just 6 weeks after I had emptied my savings account to pay for her gallbladder surgery. The same surgery that had saved her life when complications arose and her insurance company initially denied coverage for the extended hospital stay. I stood there in that sterile office with its beige walls and corporate art, holding the certified letter that had summoned me to this meeting, trying to process what I was hearing. The house on Maple Street, where I had learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where I had graduated high school from my childhood bedroom, where I had spent countless weekends helping Mom maintain the garden she loved so much, was no longer part of our family's future. At least not the part that included me. Marcus wouldn't meet my eyes. He sat there in his wrinkled button-down shirt, fidgeting with his wedding ring, occasionally nodding as Mr. Henderson explained the legal technicalities of the property transfer. When the attorney asked if I had any questions, Marcus finally looked up and said he hoped I would understand that this was what Mom wanted, what was best for everyone involved. My name is Jessica Rodriguez, and I'm 32 years old. I work as a registered nurse at Phoenix General Hospital, where I've been employed for the past 8 years. I chose nursing because I wanted to help people, to make a difference in moments when everything felt uncertain and scary. I never imagined that the most uncertain and scary moment of my own life would happen in a lawyer's office on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Growing up, our family wasn't wealthy, but we were stable. Dad worked construction until a back injury forced him into early retirement when I was 25. Mom worked part-time at a local elementary school as a teacher's aide, a job she loved because it let her be home when Marcus and I got out of school. The house on Maple Street was their pride and joy, purchased in 1987 when interest rates were high, but their dreams were higher. Dad passed away from a heart attack 3 years ago, leaving Mom the house, but also leaving her with the reality of managing everything on a fixed income. Social Security and a small pension covered her basic expenses, but there wasn't much left over for emergencies or home repairs. The house, built in 1962, was starting to show its age in ways that required more than just Mom's enthusiasm for weekend projects. Marcus had always been the artistic one in our family. 2 years younger than me, he had a talent for music and painting that everyone admired. While I was studying for nursing school and working nights at a local restaurant to pay for it, Marcus was pursuing his passion for graphic design at Arizona State University. After graduation, he struggled to find steady work in his field, taking freelance projects that paid well when they came but didn't provide the consistent income needed for adult responsibilities. 3 years ago, Marcus married his college girlfriend, Amanda, in a small ceremony in Mom's backyard. Amanda was pursuing her master's degree in education and working as a substitute teacher while she completed her studies. They were both bright, creative people who had big dreams, but were still figuring out how to turn those dreams into sustainable careers. After Dad died, Marcus and Amanda moved in with Mom temporarily while they saved money for their own place. What was supposed to be a 6-month arrangement to help everyone through a difficult transition had stretched into 3 years. Mom insisted she enjoyed the company, and Marcus and Amanda insisted they were actively looking for their own home, but the housing market in Phoenix had become increasingly expensive, making it difficult for a freelance graphic designer and substitute teacher to qualify for a mortgage. I had mixed feelings about the living arrangement. On one hand, I was glad Mom wasn't alone in that big house, especially during the first year after Dad's death, when her grief was overwhelming. On the other hand, I worried that Marcus was becoming too comfortable with the security of free housing and that Mom was enabling his tendency to avoid difficult financial decisions. My concerns seemed validated when Marcus and Amanda started talking about starting a family. They were excited about the prospect of raising children in the house where Marcus had grown up, with Grandma Linda right there to help with childcare. It was a beautiful vision, but it relied entirely on Mom's continued generosity and didn't address the fundamental issue of Marcus needing to support his growing family independently. The surgery crisis began on a Saturday morning in August. I was working a 12-hour shift in the cardiac unit when my phone rang with a call from Mom. She was at the emergency room, having been brought there by ambulance after experiencing severe abdominal pain. The initial diagnosis was gallstones, but when they took her into surgery to remove her gallbladder, the surgeon discovered complications that required additional procedures and an extended hospital stay. What should have been a routine outpatient surgery turned into a week-long hospitalization with multiple specialists involved in her care. Each day brought new procedures, new consultations, and new medical bills that quickly exceeded what her Medicare coverage would handle. The insurance company's initial approval had been for the standard gallbladder removal, but the complications weren't pre-authorized, creating a bureaucratic nightmare that threatened to leave Mom responsible for tens of thousands of dollars in medical debt.
Marcus was at the hospital every day, bringing Mom her favorite magazines and sitting with her during the long afternoons when she was recovering from each procedure. Amanda brought homemade soup and helped Mom with her physical therapy exercises. They were both genuinely caring and supportive. But when the conversations turned to the mounting medical bills, Marcus would get quiet and defer to me as the one who understood insurance and medical terminology. By Thursday of that week, the hospital's financial counselor called a meeting to discuss Mom's options. The total bill was approaching $30,000, with insurance covering approximately half. Mom was looking at $14,000 in out-of-pocket expenses that she simply didn't have. Her savings account contained less than $3,000, money she had been carefully preserving for home repairs and emergencies. The financial counselor explained payment plan options, but even the most generous plan would require monthly payments that exceeded Mom's entire monthly income from Social Security. The stress of the financial burden was clearly affecting her recovery, and her doctor expressed concern that the anxiety was interfering with her healing process. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I had been saving money for a down payment on my own house, a goal I had been working toward for 5 years. Living in a rental apartment had always felt temporary, something I was doing while I built up enough savings to become a homeowner. The $14,000 in my savings account represented years of careful budgeting, skipped vacations, and secondhand furniture. But Mom needed help, and I had the means to provide it. The choice felt obvious, even if it meant postponing my own home ownership dreams by several more years. Family comes first, and Mom had sacrificed so much for Marcus and me when we were growing up. This was my opportunity to give back, to ensure she could focus on getting better instead of worrying about medical debt. I met with the hospital's billing department that Friday and arranged to pay Mom's outstanding balance in full. The relief on Mom's face when I told her the debt was cleared was worth every dollar. She cried and told me she didn't know what she would have done without me, how grateful she was to have such a responsible and caring daughter. Marcus was equally grateful, hugging me in the hospital corridor and telling me how amazing it was that I could solve such a big problem so quickly. He promised that once he and Amanda got on their feet financially, they would find a way to pay me back, though we both knew that was more of a sentiment than a realistic plan. Mom came home from the hospital the following Monday, weak but optimistic about her recovery. Marcus and Amanda had prepared her bedroom with everything she might need, and they took turns helping her with daily activities while she regained her strength.
For several weeks, our family felt closer than we had since Dad's death, united by the shared experience of nearly losing Mom and grateful for her successful recovery. The first indication that something had changed came about a month after Mom's surgery. I stopped by the house on a Sunday afternoon to check on her progress and found Marcus and Amanda in the kitchen with Mom, surrounded by paperwork. When I asked what they were working on, Mom mentioned something about estate planning and making sure everything was organized properly. Marcus quickly changed the subject, asking about my work and whether I was dating anyone. The conversation felt odd, but I attributed it to the family's heightened awareness of mortality after Mom's health scare. It made sense that she would want to update her will and make sure her affairs were in order. I didn't think much more about it until I received the certified letter from Mr. Henderson's office 6 weeks later. The letter was brief and formal, requesting my presence at a meeting to discuss matters related to my mother's estate. When I called the office to ask for more details, the receptionist could only tell me that it was important I attend and that my brother had already confirmed his attendance. The appointment was scheduled for Tuesday at 2, and I would need to bring photo identification. Walking into that law office, I expected to discuss Mom's updated will, or perhaps some paperwork related to Dad's pension benefits. I never imagined I would discover that the house I had helped save was no longer within my mother's control to leave to anyone. The woman I had financially rescued was now financially dependent on the son I had enabled, and I was the only one who hadn't been informed of this fundamental shift in our family's dynamics. As Mr. Henderson continued explaining the legal implications of the property transfer, I found myself wondering how we had gotten to this point. How had my act of love and financial sacrifice created a situation where I was now standing in a lawyer's office feeling like a stranger in my own family story? Understanding how we reached this moment requires going back to the beginning, to the patterns that shaped our family long before medical bills and property deeds became weapons of betrayal. The Rodriguez family dynamic didn't emerge overnight in that law office. It had been carefully constructed over decades, built on assumptions about roles, responsibilities, and who could be counted on when things got difficult. My earliest memory of being the responsible one dates back to when I was 8 years old and Marcus was 6. Dad had been laid off from his construction job during a particularly harsh economic downturn in the early 1990s. Money was tight, and Mom had started working longer hours at the school to make up for Dad's lost income. It felt to me to make sure Marcus got home safely from his after-school program, helped him with his homework, and started dinner before Mom got home at 6:30.
A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. While other kids my age were playing after school or attending dance classes, I was learning to cook simple meals and making sure Marcus completed his reading assignments. Mom would come home exhausted, grateful that dinner was started and homework was done, and she would praise me for being such a mature and helpful daughter. That praise felt wonderful, and I learned quickly that being responsible earned love and appreciation in ways that being a regular kid didn't. Marcus, meanwhile, learned that someone would always be there to handle the boring, difficult parts of life. If he forgot his lunch money, I would share mine. If he didn't finish his science project, I would help him complete it the night before it was due. If he got in trouble at school for not paying attention, I would help him practice his multiplication tables until he caught up with the rest of his class. This pattern continued throughout our childhood and into our teenage years. When Marcus wanted to join the school band but couldn't afford to rent an instrument, I used my babysitting money to cover the rental fee for the first semester. When he decided he wanted to learn guitar instead and lost interest in the band after 2 months, no one mentioned the money I had spent or suggested he should pay me back. In high school, the pattern became more pronounced. Marcus was talented and charming, the kind of kid teachers remembered fondly and classmates invited to parties. He had a natural artistic ability that impressed everyone who saw his work, and he genuinely cared about people in a way that made him popular and well-liked. But he also had a tendency to overcommit and underdeliver, to start projects with enthusiasm and abandon them when they became challenging. I, on the other hand, was studious and reliable. I worked part-time at a local grocery store, maintained a high GPA, and was involved in volunteer activities that would look good on college applications. Teachers used me as an example of responsibility, and Mom often told her friends how lucky she was to have a daughter who never caused any trouble or needed any guidance. The difference in how our parents treated our mistakes was subtle but significant. When Marcus forgot to turn in a major history paper and his grade dropped from a B to a D, Mom called the teacher to explain that Marcus had been going through a difficult time adjusting to high school and asked if he could have an extension. When I received my first and only C in calculus, Mom expressed disappointment and suggested I find a tutor to make sure it didn't happen again. When Marcus decided halfway through his senior year that he didn't want to attend the state university where he had already been accepted and wanted instead to pursue art school, Mom and Dad supported his change of direction and helped him research alternative programs. When I mentioned that I was considering switching from pre-nursing to education because I was struggling with organic chemistry, Dad told me that nursing was a more practical career choice and that I shouldn't give up just because one class was challenging. These weren't malicious decisions on my parents' part. They genuinely believed they were responding appropriately to their children's different personalities and needs. Marcus was creative and sensitive, requiring encouragement and flexibility to thrive. I was steady and capable, needing challenge and structure to reach my potential. The problem was that, over time, these different approaches created an expectation that Marcus's dreams and struggles were the family's priority, while my dreams and struggles were my own responsibility to manage. The pattern became even more entrenched when we both left home for college. Marcus attended Arizona State University on a partial scholarship, with Mom and Dad covering his remaining tuition and living expenses. He changed majors 3 times, from art to communications to graphic design, extending his college career to 6 years instead of 4. Each time he changed directions, Mom and Dad assured him that finding his passion was more important than rushing to graduate. I attended Northern Arizona University on academic scholarships and worked 25 hours a week at a local clinic to cover my living expenses. When I struggled to balance work and studying during my 3rd year and considered taking a lighter course load that would extend my graduation by 1 semester, Dad reminded me that my scholarships required full-time enrollment and suggested I improve my time management skills instead. After college, the dynamic continued in new forms. Marcus moved back home while he looked for work in graphic design, a field that turned out to be highly competitive and largely centered in cities with much higher costs of living than Phoenix. He took freelance projects when he could find them, but the income was sporadic and insufficient for independent living. Mom and Dad were understanding, explaining to concerned relatives that artistic careers took time to develop and that Marcus was building his portfolio and client base. I moved into a small apartment near the hospital where I had been hired as a new graduate nurse. The work was demanding and emotionally draining, especially during my first year when I was learning to manage the responsibility of caring for critically ill patients. When I called home feeling overwhelmed or discouraged, Mom would listen sympathetically, but remind me that I had chosen a stable, well-paying profession and that the difficult days would get easier with experience. The financial patterns that would eventually lead to the property transfer crisis were established during these early years of our adult lives. When Marcus needed professional software for his graphic design work, software that cost nearly $2,000, Mom asked if I could help with the purchase since I had a steady income and Marcus was still getting established. When I needed a reliable car to get to work during rotating shifts, I researched used vehicles and saved for months to afford a down payment on my own. When Marcus met Amanda during his 5th year of college, Mom was delighted to see him happy and motivated by their relationship. Amanda was everything our parents had hoped Marcus would find in a partner: educated, kind, and supportive of his artistic pursuits. When they decided to move in together during Marcus's final year of school, Mom helped them find a small apartment near campus and occasionally sent care packages filled with groceries and household supplies.
When I started dating David, a fellow nurse who worked in the emergency department, Mom liked him well enough, but didn't express the same level of enthusiasm she had shown for Amanda. David was practical and hardworking, qualities Mom appreciated, but their relationship was seen as a natural progression for someone with my responsible personality rather than a romantic development worth celebrating. The contrast became even more apparent when both relationships ended. Marcus and Amanda broke up temporarily during his final semester when the stress of job hunting and graduation created tension between them. Mom was devastated, calling me several times to discuss how worried she was about Marcus's emotional state and whether there was anything the family could do to help them work through their problems. When David and I ended our relationship after 2 years together because we wanted different things from our futures, Mom's response was more measured. She acknowledged that breakups were difficult, but expressed confidence that I would handle the situation maturely and find someone more compatible when I was ready. These patterns might have continued indefinitely if Dad hadn't gotten sick. His first heart attack happened when I was 28 and Marcus was 26. Dad survived, but the experience forced our family to confront questions about aging, health care, and financial security that we had all been avoiding. Suddenly, Mom's future as a widow became a real possibility rather than an abstract concern. Dad's medical expenses, even with insurance, created the first significant financial strain our family had experienced since his unemployment in the 1990s. The prescription medications, follow-up appointments, and lifestyle changes required to manage his condition were expensive and ongoing. For the first time, Mom and Dad had to make difficult choices about spending, and they began to understand how quickly medical problems could create financial problems for people on fixed incomes. During this period, Marcus had finally found steady employment with a small marketing firm, and he and Amanda had rekindled their relationship. They were both earning regular paychecks, and their combined income allowed them to rent a small apartment together. For several months, it seemed like Marcus was finally achieving the independence that had eluded him throughout his 20s. But Dad's second heart attack came just 18 months after the first, and this time he didn't survive. The sudden loss devastated our family, but it hit Mom particularly hard. She had never lived alone in her adult life, having married Dad straight out of high school and raised children throughout her 20s and 30s. The prospect of managing the house, the finances, and her grief without Dad's support felt overwhelming. Marcus and Amanda's decision to move in with Mom was presented as temporary assistance during a difficult transition. They would help with household expenses and maintenance, provide companionship during Mom's adjustment to widowhood, and save money for their own home purchase while contributing to the household. It seemed like a reasonable arrangement that would benefit everyone involved. What none of us anticipated was how quickly temporary assistance would become permanent dependence, and how Mom's grief would make her increasingly unwilling to encourage Marcus's independence. The son who had always been supported through his struggles was now supporting the mother who had always been his safety net, creating a dynamic that was both enabling and codependent. By the time Mom's gallbladder surgery created a financial crisis, the patterns were so well established that no one questioned the assumption that I would be the one to solve the problem. Marcus and Amanda were part of Mom's household, responsible for her daily care and emotional support. I was the stable one with savings and no dependents, naturally positioned to handle financial emergencies. Looking back, I can see how every small decision, every family crisis weathered, and every responsibility shouldered had built toward this moment. The 8-year-old girl who made dinner while her parents worked had become the 32-year-old woman who paid for surgery while her brother lived rent-free. The patterns that had seemed loving and supportive in childhood had become manipulative and unfair in adulthood, but they had developed so gradually that no one recognized how dysfunctional they had become. The weeks following Mom's gallbladder surgery recovery revealed cracks in our family foundation that had been hidden beneath years of careful avoidance and unspoken expectations. What had initially felt like a family pulling together during a medical crisis gradually transformed into something more complex and troubling, as the financial sacrifice I had made became a catalyst for conversations and decisions that excluded me entirely.
The first sign that something fundamental had shifted came during Mom's 6-week follow-up appointment with her surgeon. I had planned to accompany her, as I had done for all her previous medical appointments since Dad's death. My nursing background made me useful for asking the right questions and understanding medical terminology that might confuse or overwhelm her. But when I arrived at the house that Tuesday morning, Marcus informed me that he and Amanda would be taking Mom to the appointment instead. The reasoning seemed practical enough. Marcus explained that Amanda had taken the day off from substitute teaching specifically to attend the appointment, and they felt it was important for them to understand Mom's ongoing care needs, since they were the ones living with her daily.
He assured me that they would call with any important updates, and Mum nodded along with his explanation, though she seemed uncomfortable with the arrangement. Standing in the driveway that morning, watching them drive away without me, I felt an unfamiliar sensation of being shut out of decisions about someone I had just spent $14,000 to help. The feeling was irrational, I told myself. Marcus and Amanda were perfectly capable of handling a routine follow-up appointment, and my presence wasn't medically necessary. But the dismissal felt deliberate in a way that made me question other assumptions about my role in Mum's life. The phone call that evening was brief and reassuring. Mum's recovery was progressing well. Her surgical sites were healing properly, and the doctor had cleared her to resume normal activities gradually. Marcus mentioned that they had discussed some follow-up tests that would be needed in a few months, routine monitoring to ensure no complications developed, but everything looked positive. The conversation was friendly and informative, yet it left me feeling like I was receiving a report about a patient rather than an update about my mother. Over the following weeks, this pattern of exclusion became more pronounced. When Mum needed to update her insurance information after changing some of her coverage options, Marcus handled the paperwork. When questions arose about her prescription medications and potential interactions, Amanda researched the answers using her laptop. When Mum decided she wanted to modify her diet to support better digestive health following the surgery, Marcus found recipes and planned meals. Each individual instance was reasonable and helpful. Marcus and Amanda were genuinely caring for Mum in ways that were thoughtful and appropriate. But collectively, these actions created a new dynamic where I was no longer the primary point of contact for Mum's needs and concerns. The daughter who had always been the emergency contact, the problem solver, the reliable one, was gradually being repositioned as the visiting relative who contributed financially but wasn't involved in daily decision-making. The shift became impossible to ignore when Mum mentioned that she had been having some financial concerns about the upcoming property tax bill. Arizona property taxes were due in October, and the amount had increased significantly from the previous year due to rising home values in their neighborhood. Mum seemed worried about covering the payment, which struck me as odd since her monthly expenses hadn't changed dramatically since before the surgery. When I offered to review her budget and help her plan for the tax payment, Marcus quickly interjected that he and Amanda had already been working with Mum on organizing her finances. They had created a spreadsheet to track her income and expenses, identified areas where she could reduce spending, and developed a plan to ensure she could cover all her obligations comfortably. The property tax situation was already being handled, he assured me. The conversation took place in Mum's kitchen while we were cleaning up after Sunday dinner, a weekly tradition that had continued even after Marcus and Amanda moved in. As Marcus described their financial planning efforts, I noticed Amanda and Mum exchanging glances in a way that suggested they were sharing information I wasn't privy to. When I asked to see the budget spreadsheet they had created, thinking my nursing experience with medical billing might offer useful insights, Mum quickly changed the subject and asking about my work schedule for the upcoming week. That evening, I drove home to my apartment feeling unsettled in ways I couldn't articulate. The family dinner had been pleasant, the conversation warm and inclusive, but something fundamental had changed about my position within the family structure. The people I had financially rescued were now managing without my input, making decisions about Mum's welfare and future that didn't require my participation or approval. The realization that hurt most was how easily they had all adapted to functioning without me.
For decades, I had been the person who researched medical questions, organized insurance paperwork, and provided financial backup during emergencies. Now, Marcus and Amanda were handling those responsibilities competently and efficiently, while Mum seemed genuinely content with the new arrangement. But the conversation I overheard 2 weeks later transformed my vague unease into active concern. I had stopped by the house unexpectedly on a Saturday afternoon to drop off some medical journals I thought Mum might find interesting, articles about nutrition and recovery after gallbladder surgery. As I approached the front door, I could hear voices coming from the living room through the slightly open window. Marcus was explaining something to Mum about equity and property values, using terms like appreciation and mortgage rates that suggested they were discussing real estate. Amanda's voice joined the conversation, mentioning something about market conditions and timing considerations. Mum's responses were harder to hear, but her tone sounded serious and engaged, as if they were discussing an important decision rather than having a casual conversation about housing trends. When I knocked on the door and entered, the conversation stopped abruptly. All three of them looked up from the kitchen table where they had been sitting with papers spread between them, and Marcus quickly gathered the documents into a stack. Mum greeted me warmly and asked about my work week, while Amanda offered to make coffee. The papers disappeared into a folder that Marcus placed in a drawer, and the conversation shifted to innocuous topics about the weather and neighborhood news. The obvious attempt to hide their discussion created a knot of anxiety in my stomach that persisted for days afterwards. In 32 years of family life, we had never had secret conversations about important topics. Even during Dad's illness, when the discussions were difficult and emotional, we had included everyone in decisions about his care and treatment. The idea that Mum, Marcus, and Amanda were making plans that required hiding papers and changing subjects felt like a fundamental betrayal of our family's communication patterns.
When I called Mom later that week to ask directly what they had been discussing, her explanation was vague and unconvincing. She mentioned something about organizing her important documents and making sure everything was properly filed in case of future emergencies. Marcus had been helping her understand some paperwork related to the house, she said, just routine maintenance of records that had gotten disorganized after Dad's death. The explanation might have been believable if not for Amanda's behavior during my next visit. She seemed nervous and distracted, avoiding eye contact and finding excuses to leave the room whenever I tried to engage her in conversation. When I asked about her graduate school progress, a topic she usually discussed enthusiastically, her responses were brief and deflective. When I mentioned that I was considering taking some vacation time and wondered if they might want to plan a small family trip to celebrate Mom's recovery, Amanda quickly said they weren't making any travel plans for the foreseeable future. The pattern of secrecy and exclusion accelerated over the following month. Phone calls to Mom were often answered by Marcus, who would provide updates about her health and activities, but would also control the length and direction of our conversations. When I suggested stopping by for our usual Sunday dinners, I was frequently told that Mom was tired or that they had other plans. When I did manage to visit, the conversations felt stilted and carefully managed, as if everyone was avoiding certain topics. Most concerning was the change in Mom's demeanor when we were alone together. During the brief moments when Marcus and Amanda left us alone, she seemed anxious and distracted rather than relaxed and talkative. She would start to mention something about plans or decisions, then stop herself and change the subject. When I asked directly if something was bothering her, she would reassure me that everything was fine, but in a way that felt rehearsed rather than genuine. The breaking point came when I received a voice message from Mom's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who had lived next door for over 20 years. Mrs. Patterson rarely called unless something was seriously wrong, so hearing her voice on my voicemail immediately triggered alarm bells. She asked me to call her back when I had a chance, mentioning that she had some concerns about activities at Mom's house that she thought I should know about. When I returned Mrs. Patterson's call that evening, she told me that she had noticed several visits from people in business attire over the past few weeks. Men in suits carrying briefcases had been coming to the house, staying for an hour or two, and leaving with Marcus accompanying them to their cars.
Mrs. Patterson had assumed they were insurance representatives dealing with Mom's medical bills. But when she mentioned the visits to Mom during a casual conversation over the fence, Mom had seemed surprised and claimed not to know what Mrs. Patterson was talking about. The discrepancy between what Mrs. Patterson had observed and what Mom had acknowledged created a chill of apprehension that I couldn't shake. The image of business people visiting the house for meetings that Mom either didn't remember or was pretending not to remember suggested something far more serious than organizing paperwork or reviewing insurance policies. That night, I lay awake constructing theories about what might be happening. The most innocent explanation was that Marcus was helping Mom with financial planning or estate organization without wanting to worry me with details. But the secrecy and Mom's apparent confusion about the visits suggested something more troubling. The family that I had financially supported was now operating in ways that deliberately excluded me, making decisions and meeting with professionals whose purposes were being hidden from both me and the neighbors. The confrontation I had been dreading finally came on a rainy Thursday evening in late September. I had decided that the mysterious meetings, the secretive behavior, and the systematic exclusion from family decisions had gone on long enough. Something was happening in Mom's house that involved legal or financial professionals, and as the daughter who had recently invested $14,000 in the family's welfare, I deserved to understand what was being planned without my knowledge. I arrived at the house unannounced, something I had never done since moving out as an adult. The discomfort of showing up without calling first felt appropriate, given how uncomfortable I had been made to feel over the past few weeks. When Marcus answered the door, his expression immediately shifted from surprise to what looked like resignation, as if he had been expecting this moment and dreading it. The living room told the story that no one had been willing to share with me. The coffee table was covered in legal documents, property records, and what appeared to be real estate appraisals. Amanda was sitting on the couch with her laptop open to a website about property transfers, while Mom sat in Dad's old recliner looking smaller and more fragile than I had seen her since the surgery. The scene had the feel of a family meeting that had been interrupted, and everyone's guilty expressions confirmed that I was the family member who had been excluded from this particular discussion. Marcus gestured for me to sit down, his demeanor shifting into what I recognized as his conflict avoidance mode. When we were children, he would use the same tone and body language when he had broken something or failed to complete a responsibility, hoping that his genuine remorse and charm would minimize the consequences of his actions. But we weren't children anymore, and the consequences of whatever was happening in this room were clearly much more serious than broken dishes or forgotten homework. The explanation came slowly, with Marcus doing most of the talking while Amanda and Mom offered occasional supporting comments. They had been working with an estate planning attorney, Marcus explained, to help Mom organize her affairs and ensure that her wishes would be carried out properly when the time came. The lawyer had recommended updating her will, organizing her financial documents, and considering various strategies to protect her assets and minimize taxes for her beneficiaries. The conversation felt rehearsed, as if they had practiced this explanation in preparation for the moment when they would have to share it with me. Marcus spoke carefully, using language that sounded like it had been borrowed from legal consultations, while Amanda nodded supportively at appropriate intervals. Mom listened to the explanation as if she were hearing some of it for the first time, occasionally looking confused about details that Marcus and Amanda seemed to understand clearly. When I asked why these estate planning discussions had been happening without my involvement, the explanation became more uncomfortable. Amanda suggested that they had wanted to get everything organized before involving me, to present a complete plan rather than including me in the messy process of figuring out options and alternatives. Marcus added that they knew how busy I was with work and didn't want to burden me with complicated legal discussions unless it was absolutely necessary. The reasoning felt patronizing and exclusionary, but I tried to approach the situation with an open mind. Estate planning was important, especially after the health scare Mom had experienced. If Marcus and Amanda were helping her organize her affairs properly, that was ultimately a positive development, even if their methods had been unnecessarily secretive. But when I asked to see the documents they had been reviewing, the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically.
Marcus and Amanda exchanged glances before Marcus explained that the paperwork was still in draft form, that the attorney had advised against sharing preliminary documents until all the options had been fully explored. Mom looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring in the gesture I recognized as her response to anxiety and uncertainty. The evasion felt deliberate and calculated, but I found myself wondering if I was being unreasonably suspicious. Perhaps they were genuinely trying to protect me from unnecessary stress, or perhaps the legal documents were too complex to review without proper context. I had no experience with estate planning beyond the basic will that I had created when I started working as a nurse, and it was possible that the process was more complicated than I understood. Amanda seemed to sense my internal conflict and offered what sounded like a reasonable compromise. She suggested that once they had finished working through all the options with the attorney, they would schedule a family meeting to review the final recommendations together. That way, I could provide input on the completed plan without having to participate in the preliminary discussions that might be confusing or overwhelming. The proposal felt like a reasonable middle ground, and I found myself wanting to accept it despite my lingering concerns about the secrecy. Marcus reinforced Amanda's suggestion by pointing out that estate planning often involved multiple revisions and consultations before reaching final decisions. Including me in every preliminary discussion would be inefficient and potentially stressful, especially given my demanding work schedule at the hospital. Mom finally spoke up, her voice quiet but supportive of the plan Marcus and Amanda had outlined. She agreed that it would be better to wait until all the options had been explored before making final decisions. She assured me that my input would be valued when the time came, but she felt confident that Marcus and Amanda understood her wishes and could represent her interests effectively during the preliminary planning stages. Sitting in that living room, surrounded by my family members who were all encouraging me to trust their judgment and wait for a future meeting that felt deliberately vague and indefinite, I experienced a moment of profound isolation. These were the people I had financially supported through a medical crisis, yet they were asking me to remain uninvolved in decisions about the very assets I had helped preserve. The pressure to accept their explanation was subtle but persistent. Marcus emphasized how grateful they all were for the financial help I had provided, how much my support had meant to Mom during her recovery. Amanda mentioned how hard they had been working to ensure that Mom's needs were met and her wishes respected. Mom herself seemed fragile and tired, as if the stress of the conversation was affecting her health. The message was clear. Questioning their process or demanding immediate inclusion would be selfish and disruptive. The responsible thing to do was trust their good intentions and wait patiently for them to include me when they felt the time was appropriate. As the family member who had always prided myself on being reasonable and supportive, I felt enormous pressure to demonstrate those qualities by accepting an arrangement that felt fundamentally wrong. But there was another layer of pressure that was even more effective than their appeals to my better nature. Marcus reminded me that Mom was still recovering from major surgery, that stress and conflict could negatively impact her healing process. Amanda mentioned that Mom had been sleeping poorly lately, worrying about family tensions and whether everyone was getting along well. The implication was unmistakable. Pushing for immediate answers or inclusion would be harmful to Mom's health and recovery. The guilt of potentially causing stress to someone who had just survived a serious medical procedure was overwhelming. The rational part of my mind recognized that this was emotional manipulation, but the caregiver part of my personality couldn't ignore the possibility that my demands for information might genuinely impact Mom's well-being. After all, I had just spent $14,000 specifically to protect her health and reduce her stress about medical bills. As the conversation continued, I found myself gradually accepting their timeline and process despite my reservations. Marcus and Amanda seemed genuinely committed to Mom's welfare, and they had been providing excellent daily care since moving into the house. Their involvement in estate planning could be seen as an extension of that care, a natural progression of their role as live-in family members who understood Mom's needs and preferences. When I finally agreed to wait for the completed estate planning recommendations before requesting detailed involvement, the relief in the room was palpable. Marcus thanked me for being understanding and patient, while Amanda expressed appreciation for my trust in their judgment. Mom seemed to relax for the first time since I had arrived, and the conversation shifted to more comfortable topics like upcoming family holidays and my work schedule. But as I drove home that evening, the feeling of having been skillfully managed lingered uncomfortably. The documents I had seen spread across the coffee table had included property appraisals and transfer paperwork that seemed more immediate and specific than preliminary estate planning typically required. The website Amanda had been viewing on her laptop had been about property transfers rather than general estate planning information. Most troubling was the realization that I had been convinced to step back from involvement in decisions about assets I had directly contributed to preserving. The house that Marcus, Amanda, and Mom were making plans for was the same house that my $14,000 had kept out of medical debt. Yet somehow, I had been positioned as the family member who should trust others to make decisions about its future without requiring transparency or immediate input. The pattern felt familiar in the most uncomfortable way. Once again, I was being asked to provide financial support while accepting minimal influence over how that support was used. Once again, my role was to be the responsible provider while others made the important decisions. And once again, questioning this arrangement was being framed as selfish and unsupportive rather than reasonable and appropriate. Lying in bed that night, I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid and suspicious without cause. Marcus and Amanda had legitimate reasons for wanting to help Mom with estate planning, and their request for time to complete the process before involving me wasn't necessarily unreasonable. But the secrecy, the exclusion, and the emotional pressure to accept their timeline all felt calculated in ways that had nothing to do with protecting Mom's health and everything to do with maintaining control over information I wasn't supposed to access. The worst part was recognizing how effectively I had been managed. Despite all my concerns and suspicions, I had agreed to wait patiently while others made decisions about my family's future. I had been convinced that demanding transparency would be harmful and selfish, that trusting their process was the mature and loving response. The daughter who had always prided herself on being responsible and reliable had been convinced that responsibility meant stepping back and trusting others to act in everyone's best interests. But as the days passed and I replayed the conversation in my mind, one detail kept bothering me more than all the others. The documents on the coffee table had included what looked like completed paperwork rather than preliminary drafts. The property appraisals had appeared official and current, suggesting that decisions were much further along than Marcus and Amanda had indicated. And Mom's confused responses to some of their explanations suggested that she might not fully understand what she was being asked to agree to. The possibility that the estate planning process was actually a property transfer process, and that my patient waiting period was simply a delay tactic to prevent me from interfering with decisions that had already been made, began to feel less like paranoia and more like the most logical explanation for everything I had observed. The certified letter arrived on a cold Monday morning in October, exactly 6 weeks after that uncomfortable conversation in Mom's living room. I was getting ready for work when I heard the mail carrier knock, and the official envelope with Henderson and Associates law firm in the return address immediately sent my pulse racing. The formal weight of the paper and the certified delivery suggested something far more serious than the routine estate planning updates I had been promised. My hands were shaking as I opened the letter in my kitchen, still in my scrubs with coffee growing cold on the counter. The language was formal and legal, requesting my presence at a meeting to discuss matters related to my mother's estate and property holdings. The appointment was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 2 p.m, and I was instructed to bring photo identification and any relevant documentation regarding my financial contributions to family matters. That last phrase hit me like a physical blow. Any relevant documentation regarding my financial contributions to family matters? The language was too specific to be coincidental, too pointed to be part of routine estate planning.
Someone had told the attorney about the $14,000 I had paid for Mom's surgery, and that information was now part of whatever legal matter required my presence. I called the law office immediately, hoping to get more information about the purpose of the meeting, but the receptionist could only confirm the appointment details and emphasize that my attendance was strongly recommended. When I asked if other family members would be present, she paused before telling me that my brother had already confirmed his attendance. The way she said it suggested that Marcus had been involved in scheduling the meeting, possibly had been the one to initiate whatever legal process was now requiring my participation. The week between receiving the letter and attending the meeting was the longest week of my life. I went through the motions of my shifts at the hospital, caring for patients and managing medical emergencies, but my mind was constantly spinning through possible explanations for what was happening. The most optimistic scenario was that Mom had decided to formalize some kind of repayment plan for the money I had contributed to her medical expenses. The most pessimistic scenario was something I didn't want to allow myself to consider fully. I tried calling Mom multiple times during that week, but my calls consistently went to voicemail. When she did return my calls, the conversations were brief and awkward, with Mom claiming she was tired or busy whenever I tried to ask about the attorney meeting. Marcus didn't return my calls at all, and Amanda gave me vague responses about being swamped with substitute teaching assignments when I managed to reach her.
The isolation and secrecy that had been building for months was now complete. The family members I had financially supported through a medical crisis were now coordinating with attorneys about matters that apparently concerned my financial contributions, and I was being systematically excluded from all information about the process until the moment when my presence became legally necessary. By Friday of that week, my anxiety had transformed into something more productive: determination to understand what was happening, whether or not my family was willing to explain it. I had spent months accepting their assurances that everything would be explained eventually, trusting their claims that secrecy was temporary and protective. But the attorney letter made it clear that decisions were being made and legal processes were moving forward, with or without my understanding or consent. That evening, I sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop and began researching everything I could find about property transfers, estate planning, and family financial law in Arizona. What I discovered was both enlightening and alarming. Arizona law allowed property transfers between family members with relatively minimal legal oversight, especially when the transfer involved parents and adult children. The process could be completed quickly and quietly, with the new property owner taking immediate legal control regardless of who had financially contributed to maintaining or preserving the property. The research revealed several scenarios that could explain the attorney meeting. If Mom had transferred the house to Marcus, I could be called as a witness to confirm financial contributions that might affect the legal validity of the transfer. If there were disputes about the transfer, I might be asked to provide documentation about my $14,000 payment to establish my potential interest in the property. Or, in the worst-case scenario, the transfer might already be complete and I was being summoned to acknowledge legal changes that had already occurred. The possibility that the house had already been transferred without my knowledge felt both impossible and inevitable. Impossible because Mom would never make such a significant decision without discussing it with me first. Inevitable because every pattern of secrecy and exclusion over the past months pointed toward exactly this kind of dramatic betrayal. Saturday morning, I made a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. Instead of waiting until Tuesday to learn what had been done, with or without my knowledge, I was going to use my nursing contacts to gather information independently. Healthcare workers often developed relationships with professionals in related fields, and I knew several people who had connections to legal and real estate industries. My friend Rebecca, who worked in the hospital's financial department, had mentioned that her sister worked as a paralegal for a firm that handled real estate transactions. When I called Rebecca and explained that I needed to understand some property transfer documents related to family estate planning, she offered to have her sister review any paperwork I could obtain. The offer felt like the first helpful resource I had accessed in months. But I didn't have any paperwork to review, which led to my next uncomfortable but necessary decision. I needed to see what public records might reveal about recent activity related to Mom's property. Arizona maintained online databases of property transactions, and as a family member with legitimate concerns about estate planning, I had every right to research the current status of property that I had financially helped to preserve. The search was easier than I had expected and more devastating than I had prepared for. Mom's house on Maple Street showed a property transfer recorded just 3 weeks earlier, transferring ownership from Linda Rodriguez to Marcus Rodriguez for the consideration of $1. The transfer was recorded as a family gift with no mortgage or liens attached to the property. The date of the transfer was exactly 2 weeks after the conversation in Mom's living room when I had agreed to wait patiently for estate planning to be completed. Staring at my laptop screen, reading the legal description of property that no longer belonged to my mother, I felt a combination of rage and heartbreak that was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The house that my $14,000 had helped save from medical debt had been given away to my brother while I was being told to trust the process and wait for information that would never come. But the property records revealed even more disturbing information. The transfer had been notarized and witnessed, indicating that Mom had appeared before legal professionals and confirmed her intention to give the house to Marcus. This wasn't a case of financial manipulation or elder abuse where Mom had been tricked into signing documents she didn't understand. According to the legal paperwork, she had voluntarily and officially transferred her most valuable asset to the son who had been living rent-free, while the daughter who had paid for her mother's surgery was kept completely uninformed. The remainder of that weekend was spent researching my legal options and trying to understand what recourse, if any, might be available. Arizona law generally supported property owners' rights to transfer their assets to family members as they saw fit, regardless of who had contributed financially to maintaining or preserving the property. Unless I could prove that the transfer had been made under duress or that Mom lacked the mental capacity to make such decisions, the legal system would likely recognize Marcus as the rightful owner of property that had been freely given to him. The legal research was sobering and infuriating, but it also clarified my thinking in ways that months of family manipulation had obscured. This wasn't about estate planning or protecting Mom's interests. This was about Marcus and Amanda securing their housing situation permanently while ensuring that I had no legal claim to property that my money had helped to preserve. They had used Mom's surgery recovery as cover for orchestrating a property transfer that would have been much more difficult to justify and execute if I had been informed and involved in the process. By Sunday evening, I had developed a plan for the Tuesday meeting that felt both appropriate and necessary. Instead of attending as the confused and excluded family member that Marcus and Amanda expected, I would arrive as someone who understood exactly what had been done and was prepared to respond accordingly. I would bring documentation of my $14,000 payment, copies of the property transfer records I had discovered, and a clear statement of my position regarding the deception that had been practiced against me. The most important decision I made that weekend was to stop trying to preserve family relationships that had been fundamentally damaged by betrayal and deception. For months, I had been walking on eggshells, trying to maintain harmony while being systematically excluded and manipulated. The people who should have been protecting my interests had instead been working to undermine them, using my own caring nature and financial generosity as weapons against me. Monday morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in over 2 years. I needed the day to prepare for a confrontation that would likely change my family relationships permanently. I spent the morning organizing financial documents, printing legal research, and preparing questions that would force honest answers about what had been done and why. But the most important preparation was psychological. I had to accept that the family dynamics I had grown up with, the patterns of responsibility and sacrifice that had defined my adult relationships with Mom and Marcus, were not just unhealthy, but actively destructive. The people I had been trying to protect and support had been working against my interests while accepting my financial contributions and emotional labor. The daughter who had always put family first was finally ready to put herself first, regardless of how uncomfortable that made everyone else. The responsible one, who had always solved other people's problems, was finally ready to create some problems for the people who had been taking advantage of her reliability and generosity. Walking into that law office on Tuesday afternoon, I knew that whatever happened in that meeting would mark the end of the family relationships I had known and the beginning of something entirely different. For the first time in my adult life, I was entering a family conflict as someone who had nothing left to lose and no interest in preserving peace at the expense of justice. The law office of Henderson and Associates occupied the third floor of a modern building in downtown Phoenix, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the mountains in the distance. As I sat in the waiting area that Tuesday afternoon, I watched Marcus pace nervously near the reception desk, checking his phone repeatedly and avoiding eye contact with me. His discomfort was obvious and satisfying in equal measure. For the first time in months, he was the one feeling uncertain and unprepared. When Mr. Henderson emerged from his office to greet us, his professional demeanor couldn't quite mask his obvious discomfort with the situation. He was a man in his late 50s with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, and his expression suggested that he understood this meeting was likely to be more confrontational than routine. As he led us into his conference room, he mentioned that he had prepared several documents for our review and discussion. The conference room was designed to project authority and calm, with dark wood furniture and legal books lining the walls. But the atmosphere was anything but calm as we took our seats around the polished table. Marcus sat across from me, still fidgeting with his phone, while Mr. Henderson arranged papers at the head of the table. The power dynamic that had defined our family for so long was about to be completely reversed. Mr. Henderson began with what was clearly a prepared statement about the purpose of our meeting. He explained that he had been working with my family on estate planning matters, specifically regarding the transfer of property ownership to ensure proper legal documentation and tax considerations. His language was careful and formal, designed to frame the property transfer as a routine family planning decision rather than the deception and betrayal that it actually represented. When he finished his prepared remarks and asked if I had any questions, I placed my folder of documents on the table and opened it deliberately. The sound of papers rustling seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room, and Marcus finally looked directly at me for the first time since we had arrived. His expression shifted from nervous discomfort to genuine alarm as he recognized that I was prepared for this meeting in ways he hadn't expected. I began by acknowledging that I understood a property transfer had taken place, transferring ownership of Mom's house from Linda Rodriguez to Marcus Rodriguez for the consideration of $1. Mr. Henderson nodded, confirming the basic facts, while Marcus stared at the table, apparently realizing that his assumption about my ignorance had been incorrect. Then I placed copies of my financial records on the table, documenting my $14,000 payment I had made to cover Mom's surgical expenses just 2 months before the property transfer. I explained that this payment had been made specifically to prevent the family home from being endangered by medical debt, and that I had made the financial sacrifice based on the understanding that I was preserving an asset that would remain within the family for Mom's security and eventual inheritance distribution. Mr. Henderson's discomfort became more pronounced as I presented my documentation. He glanced at Marcus, who was now looking distinctly pale, and then back at the papers I had provided. When I asked whether my financial contribution to preserving the property had been disclosed to him during the transfer process, his hesitation was answer enough. The silence stretched uncomfortably before Marcus finally spoke.
His voice was defensive and strained as he began explaining that the property transfer had been Mom's idea, that she had wanted to ensure the house stayed in the family, and that Marcus and Amanda would have housing security as they started their married life together. He emphasized that the transfer was a gift from a mother to her son, a legal transaction that required no input or approval from other family members.
I listened to his explanation without interrupting, noting how he carefully avoided mentioning the timing of the transfer or the secrecy that had surrounded the entire process. When he finished, I asked him directly whether he believed it was ethical to accept a gift of property that had been preserved through my financial sacrifice while deliberately concealing that gift from me until it was legally complete and irreversible. The question hung in the air like an accusation, which it was. Marcus's attempts to justify his actions became increasingly desperate and unconvincing. He claimed that they had always planned to tell me about the transfer once the legal process was complete. He insisted that my financial contribution had been a gift, with no expectation of return or influence over family decisions. He argued that Mom had the right to distribute her assets however she chose, regardless of who had contributed to preserving them. Each of his justifications revealed the careful planning that had gone into excluding me from a decision that directly affected the value of my financial contribution. This wasn't an oversight or a miscommunication. It was a deliberate strategy to secure a valuable asset while preventing the person who had helped preserve that asset from having any input or influence over its disposition. Mr. Henderson attempted to mediate the growing tension by focusing on the legal aspects of the situation. He explained that property transfers between family members were legally binding once properly executed, and that my financial contribution to Mom's medical expenses, while generous, didn't create any legal claim to the property itself. From a purely legal standpoint, the transfer was valid and irreversible. But the legal validity of the transfer wasn't my primary concern. My concern was the breach of trust and family loyalty that the secret transfer represented. I had been systematically deceived by the people I had financially supported, manipulated into waiting patiently while they secured legal ownership of an asset I had helped preserve. When I stated this directly, Marcus's defensive facade finally cracked. His voice became emotional as he explained how scared he and Amanda had been about their housing security, how expensive rent had become in Phoenix, and how uncertain his freelance income made their future seem. He described the property transfer as an opportunity to provide stability for their family, especially as they hoped to have children in the near future. His emotional appeal was genuine and touching, but it completely ignored the fundamental issue of trust and communication. Every concern he raised about housing security and financial stability could have been addressed through honest family discussion. The decision to handle these concerns through secret legal proceedings while excluding me from the process revealed a level of deception that transformed legitimate worries into inexcusable betrayal. I explained this to both Marcus and Mr. Henderson, emphasizing that my objection wasn't to helping family members achieve housing security. My objection was to being used as a financial resource while being excluded from decisions about how that financial contribution would ultimately benefit the family. If Marcus and Amanda needed housing security, we could have discussed options that acknowledged my contribution to preserving the property they now owned. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, covering legal options, family dynamics, and the practical implications of the property transfer. Mr. Henderson explored whether any compromise solutions might be possible, but the fundamental reality was unchangeable. Marcus now legally owned a house that my money had helped save from medical debt, and no legal mechanism existed to reverse or modify that outcome. As the meeting drew to a close, Mr. Henderson asked whether I intended to pursue any legal action regarding the transfer. The question seemed routine, but Marcus's reaction suggested it was anything but routine for him. His anxiety about potential legal consequences was obvious, and for the first time in our adult relationship, he was the one facing uncertainty, while I held the power to determine what happened next. I told them that I had no intention of pursuing legal action to challenge the property transfer. The house now belonged to Marcus, and I accepted that legal reality.
But I also made it clear that I had no intention of continuing financial support for family members who had demonstrated such a complete disregard for honesty and communication. The daughter who had always been the family's financial safety net was permanently withdrawing from that role. The immediate consequences of this decision were significant and uncomfortable for everyone involved. Marcus and Amanda would need to manage all housing expenses, property taxes, and maintenance costs without any financial backup from me. Mom would need to navigate her ongoing healthcare and living expenses without the assumption that I would cover any shortfalls or emergencies. And I would need to rebuild my understanding of family relationships around boundaries and mutual respect rather than financial obligation and emotional manipulation. Walking out of that law office, I felt a combination of sadness and relief that was difficult to process. The family relationships I had known were permanently changed, but the exhausting cycle of financial obligation and emotional manipulation was finally broken. For the first time in my adult life, my financial security was completely under my own control, free from the constant threat of family emergencies that required my immediate sacrifice.
The drive home gave me time to reflect on what had been lost and what had been gained. I had lost $14,000, a family home that held decades of memories, and relationships with family members who had chosen deception over honesty. But I had gained something equally valuable: the knowledge that I could survive betrayal, protect my own interests, and establish boundaries that prioritized my well-being over others' comfort. The morning I signed the closing papers on my own home in Scottsdale, exactly 14 months after that devastating meeting at Henderson and Associates, I understood for the first time what financial independence actually meant. The modest 3-bedroom house with its desert landscaping and mountain views represented more than just homeownership. It represented the life I could build when I stopped funding other people's dreams and started investing in my own future. The real estate agent, a cheerful woman named Susan, handed me the keys with a congratulatory smile, but I think she was surprised by my emotional reaction. Standing in the empty living room with afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that belonged to me, I cried tears that contained years of suppressed frustration, grief, and ultimately relief. This space was mine, purchased with money I had earned and saved, without the constant threat of family emergencies requiring my immediate financial sacrifice. The process of furnishing and decorating the house became an exercise in discovering preferences I had never allowed myself to explore. For years, my living spaces were temporary and functional, decorated with whatever furniture I could afford after setting aside money for family crises. Now, I could choose colors I actually liked, invest in quality pieces that would last for years, and create an environment that reflected my personality rather than my budget constraints. More importantly, I could make long-term financial commitments without fear that a family emergency would force me to break them. The mortgage payment, homeowner's insurance, and property taxes represented stability rather than burden because they were obligations I had chosen from myself rather than obligations imposed by other people's poor decisions. The career opportunities that emerged from my newfound financial stability exceeded anything I had imagined possible during my years as the family safety net. With my housing secured and my savings account growing rather than constantly depleted, I was able to pursue professional development opportunities that had previously been impossible to afford or commit to. I enrolled in an executive leadership program specifically designed for healthcare professionals, a 6-month intensive course that cost nearly $8,000 but promised to accelerate career advancement for participants. During my years of family financial management, such an investment would have been unthinkable. The money would have been needed for Marcus's latest crisis or Mom's unexpected expenses. But now, investing in my own professional growth felt not only possible, but essential. The program connected me with healthcare leaders from across the Southwest, introducing me to a network of professionals who viewed career development as a continuous process, rather than a luxury to be pursued only when family obligations allowed. These relationships opened doors to consulting opportunities, speaking engagements, and eventually a position as director of nursing operations at a premier cardiac treatment center in Phoenix. The salary increase that came with the promotion was substantial, but more importantly, the role represented recognition of capabilities I had been developing for years while simultaneously managing family crises. For the first time in my career, I could focus entirely on professional excellence without the distraction of family members who needed immediate financial assistance or emotional support for problems they had created. My relationship with Mom evolved along paths I hadn't anticipated during those angry months following the property transfer revelation. Initially, our conversations were stilted and uncomfortable, filled with unspoken accusations and defensive justifications. She seemed genuinely perplexed by my continued anger about decisions she viewed as practical family planning, while I struggled to articulate why the secrecy and deception had been more hurtful than the financial loss itself. The breakthrough came during an unexpected conversation about Sophia, Marcus and Amanda's daughter, who was now 18 months old and beginning to display the determined personality that apparently ran in our family. Mom had called to share stories about Sophia's latest developmental milestones, and somehow the conversation shifted to discussing what kind of family environment we wanted Sophia to grow up experiencing. For the first time, Mom acknowledged that the secrecy surrounding the property transfer might not have been the best approach, not because it was financially unfair, but because it had created family divisions that Sophia would eventually become aware of. She didn't apologize for the transfer itself, but she expressed regret that the process had damaged relationships rather than strengthening them as she had hoped. This conversation opens space for a different kind of relationship between us, one based on shared concern for Sophia's well-being rather than financial transactions or crisis management. We established a pattern of monthly phone calls focused on family news and personal updates, carefully avoiding discussions of money, property, or past grievances that neither of us seemed capable of resolving satisfactorily.
My relationship with Marcus proved more challenging to rebuild, partly because his approach to our conflict involved continued attempts to justify his actions rather than acknowledge their impact. 6 months after the law office meeting, he called to inform me that Amanda was pregnant again, delivering the news with an undertone that suggested he expected this development to automatically repair our damaged relationship. When I congratulated him warmly but didn't offer financial assistance with pregnancy expenses or baby preparations, his disappointment was obvious. The conversation revealed that despite everything that had happened, he still expected me to resume my role as the family's financial backup system when circumstances warranted it. The idea that my withdrawal from that role might be permanent rather than temporary seemed to genuinely surprise him. The birth of their second child, a son they named Diego, created another opportunity to test and reinforce the boundaries I had established. Mom called repeatedly to share updates about the new baby and to suggest that becoming an aunt to 2 children might inspire me to reconsider my position on family financial support. The implication was that the children's needs should override any lingering resentment about how their parents had treated me. But having 2 young nephews actually strengthened my commitment to maintaining healthy family dynamics. I wanted Sophia and Diego to grow up understanding that love and money were separate commodities, that adults were responsible for solving their own problems, and that family relationships should be based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. The best example I could provide for them was to demonstrate what healthy boundaries looked like in practice. I maintained cordial relationships with Marcus and Amanda for the children's sake, sending appropriate gifts for birthdays and holidays, but I didn't resume the crisis management role that had defined my family relationships for so many years. When Marcus's freelance business struggled during an economic downturn, I listened to his concerns with genuine sympathy, but didn't offer loans or bailouts. When Amanda needed expensive dental work that their insurance didn't fully cover, I expressed support without offering to pay for procedures that were ultimately their responsibility to manage. These decisions were sometimes difficult, especially when the financial needs seemed legitimate and my increased income would have made assistance relatively easy to provide. But I had learned that the ease of providing financial help was exactly what made it so dangerous to family dynamics. When help is easy to give, it becomes easy to expect, and expectations gradually transform into obligations that undermine rather than support healthy relationships.
The professional counselor I began seeing during the months following the property transfer crisis helped me understand these patterns within the framework of family systems theory. She explained how families often develop rigid roles that persist long after they cease to be functional, how crisis cycles can become psychologically addictive for both rescuers and those being rescued, and how changing these entrenched patterns requires someone to have the courage to stop participating in the dysfunction. Working with Dr. Martinez also helped me examine my own motivations for maintaining the rescuer role for so many years. Part of my identity had been constructed around being needed, being perceived as responsible and reliable, being the family member who could solve problems that others couldn't manage independently. Giving up that central role meant accepting that I might be less important to my family's daily operations, but it also meant that my relationships with them could be based on genuine affection rather than financial necessity. The friends I developed during this period of personal reconstruction were qualitatively different from the relationships I had maintained during my years as the family crisis manager. These were people who valued my company for its own merits rather than for my ability to solve their problems or provide financial assistance during difficult periods. Learning to build friendships based on mutual enjoyment rather than mutual neediness was a skill I had to consciously develop as an adult. Maria, my colleague who had become a close friend and confidant, often reminded me that healthy relationships should energize rather than drain the people involved. Her observation helped me evaluate all my connections, both familial and social, based on whether they contributed positively to my well-being or consistently detracted from it. This wasn't about becoming selfish or abandoning people during legitimate difficulties. It was about distinguishing between relationships that involved balanced, mutual support and relationships that consisted primarily of one-sided rescue operations. The dating relationship I began with Tom, an emergency room physician I met during a professional conference, represented the first romantic connection I had pursued since my family dynamics had consumed so much of my emotional and financial energy. Tom's approach to relationships emphasized partnership and shared responsibility rather than rescue and dependency, qualities that I found both attractive and initially unfamiliar. Learning to participate in a relationship where both people contributed equally to problem solving and financial management required me to unlearn patterns of behavior that had become automatic during my years as the family safety net. Tom's expectation that I would protect my own interest while considering his needs was refreshing but also challenging for someone who had been conditioned to prioritize others' immediate needs over her own long-term well-being. The personal growth that emerged from establishing and maintaining healthy boundaries extended far beyond my family relationships. At work, I became more selective about the additional responsibilities I accepted, more assertive about compensation that reflected my contributions, and more strategic about professional development opportunities that aligned with my career goals rather than simply filling gaps created by other people's needs. This increased focus on my own professional trajectory resulted in recognition and opportunities that had been impossible during my years of constant family crisis management. Within 18 months of the property transfer crisis, I was invited to speak at a national conference about nursing leadership, published an article about healthcare administration in a professional journal, and was offered a position on the board of directors for a nonprofit organization focused on healthcare access.
Looking back at the woman who had walked into that law office expecting to discuss routine estate planning, only to discover that her mother had secretly transferred the family home to her brother, I felt a complex mixture of compassion and pride. Compassion for someone who had been so thoroughly conditioned to prioritize others' comfort over her own security. Pride for someone who had found the strength to break destructive patterns, even when doing so required accepting painful losses and confronting difficult truths about the people she loved most. The $14,000 I had spent on mom's surgery would have provided a substantial down payment on the house I eventually purchased, but the education I received about family dynamics, personal boundaries, and the crucial difference between helping and enabling proved far more valuable than the money I lost. Understanding these concepts transformed not only my family relationships, but every aspect of my life, from career advancement to romantic partnerships to my ability to create a living environment that reflected my values and priorities. If I could travel back in time and change what happened, I wouldn't. The betrayal was devastating, but it was also revelatory. It forced me to examine assumptions about family loyalty and financial obligation that might have otherwise controlled my decisions for decades. It taught me that love without boundaries isn't genuine love, and that sacrifice without mutual respect isn't meaningful contribution. Most importantly, it demonstrated that the most crucial person to rescue in any crisis is yourself. Not because other people's needs don't matter, but because you cannot genuinely help others from a position of financial insecurity, emotional depletion, and resentful obligation. The courage to establish boundaries and protect your own well-being isn't selfish behavior. It's the foundation that makes authentic generosity and healthy relationships possible. The transformation from family rescuer to self-advocate wasn't easy, but it was absolutely worth every difficult conversation, every moment of loneliness, and every dollar that was lost in the process of discovering who I could become when I stopped defining myself through other people's crises. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.